Well, our next panel is going to look forward for us and across the rest of 2024 and what's to come. So get out your tea leaves and get ready to read. This panel is going to lead us through that. I'd like to introduce first the moderator, Kurt Levy, whom you've heard from earlier, the president of the Committee for Justice, and a constitutional and attorney, as well as other civil rights. And these areas are something that he has led Committee for Justice on for a long time, as well as confirmation battles up and down the spectrum from district courts to the Supreme Court. Our panelists are Fred Ashton, competition economics analyst with the American Action Forum. And Fred is involved in the analysis of regulatory and legislative proposals relative to competition, antitrust, merger, consolidation, those kinds of economic areas. Formerly was with the National Electrical Manufacturers Association. Tirzah Duren is Vice President of Policy and Research with the American Consumer Institute. As ACI's Vice President, works on a wide variety of technology and regulatory issues. Was formerly at the premier think tank in the state of Pennsylvania and has been involved with think tanks around the globe. And Paul Steidler is Senior Fellow with the Lexington Institute. Paul is involved on federal issues and policy of technology and logistics. So welcome all of our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you all. Welcome to the third and final panel, which will be followed by a reception in the rooms across the hall. This panel is about what to expect from the FTC and the DOJ Antitrust Division in 2024. So we'll be looking forward. And I'm going to start it off with an introductory question, which I'll ask each of the panelists to answer. After that first question, you can all just jump in when you want. But and let's start with Fred. What one thing will you be most closely watching at the FTC and/or DOJ in 2024?
So, Kurt, thank you for having me, and thanks to the Committee for Justice for hosting this event. So, to get to 2024, I think we need to take a step back. And in 2022 and 2023, we saw a lot of posturing from the FTC and the Department of Justice. They announced a lot of big policy changes. They withdrew old policy statements. And the FTC even put several industries on notice. But when we get to the year ahead and into an election year, the agencies will move away from this posturing and bring these policies to the next level. 2024 is going to be about implementation and execution from the agencies. Can they convince the public and can they convince the courts that these new policies were designed to promote competition and protect consumers from anti-competitive behavior, or were they designed to serve other political purposes? I'm skeptical they'll be successful, but I'll be looking for which cases the agencies choose to test some of the various theories of harm in the new merger guidelines, specifically the structural presumptions, how the proposed changes to the HSR pre-merger notification program will impact merger activity, especially among small businesses. And I'll be keeping an eye out for the any challenges to the FTC's proposed ban on non-compete agreements when that's finalized. So 2024 is going to be just as busy as 2023.
Tirzah?
Yes, so again, thank you for having us. I'm with the American Consumer Institute, so it's probably not very surprising that what I'm going to be focusing on this year, as well as what I focused on in past years, is really looking at antitrust enforcement and looking at it through the lens of the consumer welfare standard. And there's a couple ways that I think this might really be visible within the coming years. One of them is that we do have the new merger guidelines, and within those guidelines we have a lot of presumptions, structural presumptions about anti-competitiveness. So looking to see if we're just going to rely solely on structural presumptions or if we're going to try to tie that in with the consumer. And there's some concern that they're going to completely kind of negate some of the vertical integration and the size that can bring consumer benefits. And then the last area that I think I'm going to continue to look into and watch pretty closely is the very creative market definitions that are being used. That's a particular interest to me because it seems like you're completely negating a lot of the consumer benefits when you're kind of designing market definitions very specifically to try to make it look like some companies have more market power than they may or may not have. And so that's what we are looking forward to this year.
Paul?
Yes, thank you, Kurt. The operative word for 2024 at the FTC, I think, is going to be chaos. I think you're going to see more chaos than you've seen previously. I think you're going to see more chaos than Christine Wilson outlined in her March letter last year to President Biden. We are talking about things going down in an election year here, where you have an administration that is very hostile to business, and the other campaign which is very hostile to certain types of businesses. We have potential chaos, and I'll defer to Fred for the specifics on this, but an implementation of the changes in the Hart-Scott-Rodino measures, which are a big deal. There are going to be new guidelines this year about non-compete agreements, which really get into the relationships that many workers have with their employees, the FTC inserting itself there. We're going to have chaos because Europe is very emboldened to go after U.S. tech companies with the Digital Markets Act, which takes full effect on March 6th. There's a certain chippiness, a certain cockiness that has come into play from Europe's regulators about this, and they're being aided and abetted on this by the FTC. Also, I really don't think it matters much if the two new Republican commissioners are confirmed, though that will be an important step and will make things better going forward here. But, nominees Ferguson and Holyoke would bring a lot to bear and would be very beneficial for regulating things. But it's hard to, it's very difficult to see them getting confirmed at this point. You want to talk about chaos. There's chaos in the Republican caucus of the U.S. Senate, which in the past couple of days has only gotten worse. There's been chaos from Congress in general with a lack of oversight or effective oversight of the FTC, especially on the Senate side. I think the House is going to continue to push through those measures, but frankly, they have bigger priorities that they're focused with. And I'll close with this final happy thought. One thing that we increasingly have to be aware of this year is the danger of a cyber attack, which, something similar to what happened to the ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline back in 2021, which led to a national emergency declaration from President Biden, really freaked the country out for a couple of days because there were disruptions in gasoline supplies. There have been some very disconcerting hacks recently against Microsoft and Hewlett-Packard. But even something like that can be, even if the damage to the economy or to the or to consumers is not that high, it provides a pretext for a lot of anxiety and a lot more economic meddling by the FTC. So the three things I would watch for are chaos, chaos, chaos. And if that gives you a reason to go to the bar afterwards, More power to you.
Fortunately, we will have an open bar, so we can mourn or chat about the coming chaos. Let me ask you all, and any and all of you can jump in. If we were sitting here, or perhaps when we're sitting here a year from now, and looking back at what M&A enforcement was like in the past year from both FTC and DOJ, how would we sum it up? How would we sum up 2024, including, if you want, the impact of the new merger guidelines and the pre-merger notification changes?
I think one of the things is we're going to see the agencies continue to do what they've been trying to do for the past few years. And what we see is hesitancy or an outright hostility towards certain settlements or certain agreements to get a merger that they fear might be anti-competitive to a competitive place. And we see an increase in merger abandonments, and we see an increase in litigation. However, we don't necessarily see an increase in the success rate of that litigation. So I think we're going to see kind of more of the same. And unfortunately, that means a lot of mergers that could have potentially been beneficial for consumers will likely be abandoned because they don't want to go through litigation, or they don't want to, the agency itself doesn't want to do any settlements or remedies on that front.
I think the HSR process is going to cause a lot of problems, especially when it's first implemented. I could see companies who are filing the forms for the first time, especially smaller firms and medium-sized businesses, have to redo it on a technicality because they didn't fully cooperate with all the new restrictions and requirements from the FTC and DOJ. When you look at the HSR annual report to Congress from the agencies, 25% of acquired companies have assets less than $50 million. These are small businesses that don't have the resources to hire the $350 million extra dollars the FTC estimates this will cost. And we could see your innovators, your entrepreneurs are from small businesses, and we could see a lot of those companies lose funding from venture capital because the venture capitalist knows merging with a larger firm might not be an option in the future. So I could see HSR really getting in the way of efficient mergers that pose no threat to competition.
I think there are certainly going to be fewer mergers going forward. That's by design. Everybody knows what the environment is like. You may see some companies, in fact, you probably will see some companies wanting to run out the clock because they anticipate there's going to be a change in administrations, or they may just hope that there are somehow some changes at the FTC where you get new commissioners and new practices and things become calmer and more rational as you enter 2025. The thing that's deeply concerning to us at the Lexington Institute, and we're a conservative think tank in Arlington, been around 25 plus years, is the effect that Chair Khan and this administration's proposals, the chilling effect that they're having on the businesses that Fred mentioned, those under $50 million businesses which are looking for a merger and are not involved in activities that are in any way, shape, or form going to harm consumers generally or the American economy. And just this braggadocio that we have stopped mergers from going forward is very disconcerting. It's very unsettling. There is a profound lack of respect in this country to the entrepreneurs and the innovators who build companies which they have built with the intention of wanting to sell. That's part of their plan. They may be running these companies at a loss because they want to be able to sell them and create value that somebody else can maximize. And one thing that presents, I think, some optimism is those entrepreneurs, those people who are building these businesses quietly, creating jobs, creating new technologies, making it easier for each of us in the day-to-day things that we do. somehow, some way, there's got to be a reappreciation of them going forward. I don't think Ronald Reagan or Bill Clinton or even Barack Obama would have the disdain to business innovators that currently seems to be out there, and to just blanketly talk about the fact that, oh, we've stopped mergers and that's good. It's a little bit like saying, well, we've stopped marriages and that's good, because there would have been a lot of problems with a lot of those going forward, and people would have been hurt, and things have to be reevaluated here. It's, it's controlling, it's illogical, and most disturbingly, I think it's dispiriting, and it goes against what the American work ethic is, the American dream, the American spirit that goes back 200 plus years.
And before I go on to the next question, I wanted to add one thing. Was mentioned the that when you discourage mergers, the negative effect it has on entrepreneurs and on venture capitalists who will fund those entrepreneurs, but also on the employees of those startups. And I know that personally. Before law school, I worked for several years for an AI startup. Back in the early days of AI, and why did I take a job with a startup, which was risky, when I could have had a equal or better paying job with a big firm that was doing AI? Well, it's because the dream that your stock options are going to be worth something someday. Same as motivates people now. And sure, the stock options could be worth something because of an IPO, but that was a long shot then as it is now. What we really hoped for is that the company would be bought out, which is, by the way, what happened right around the time that I went to law school. And as a matter of fact, it helped pay for law school. So I just want to stress that point, that a lot of people go to work for those startups because of the promise of a merger. And if you take away that promise, the best people will go to the big corporations, which is exactly the opposite of what you would think Lena Khan would want.
And Kurt, Silicon Valley Bank the now defunct Silicon Valley Bank, did a survey of entrepreneurs and found 60% on the outset of starting their business view acquisition as their exit strategy. It's not a rounding error. Only 14% want to be in that business for the long term. Acquisition is the goal. And for an FTC so concerned about labor.
Yeah. Very, very good point. So, this administration, as several of you have alluded to, particularly the FTC, has been, very aggressive when it comes to antitrust, particularly mergers. How different is that from past administrations? And can we expect any changes? Is it only going to get worse? And I guess I know that Tirzah's organization is doing a study sort of comparing, this FTC to past FTCs, if I understand correctly. So maybe I'll start it off with Tirzah, but I also want to hear from Fred and Paul.
Yeah, I can go ahead and just give a brief overview. I kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier. But yeah, ACI, we're working on a study where we look at complaints from the FTC and DOJ from the end of Clinton era forward. And what we see is a couple notable differences between the different administrations. One of them is under the Biden administration, we see that there are actually fewer overall complaints, which you might think like, oh, that's a good thing, but that's kind of where the good news ends, if you consider that good news. And what we see is a lot of the rhetoric coming out of these agencies really playing out in the data. Khan and Cantor have both publicly stated that they don't like remedies. They think they really need to change a lot of the legal precedent. And so the way to do that is through litigation. So you see that with the fact that they have significantly dropped the rates of settlements that they're willing to do with these merging parties. And also you see kind of the flip side of that is a lot of these mergers are getting abandoned. And just like you mentioned earlier, that's not necessarily a good thing. If you look at the percentage of mergers that actually result in a complaint, most of them are deemed pretty fairly competitive, even according to the agencies themselves. And the next thing that you see is that more of these cases are getting litigated, but a fewer percentages of those cases are getting won. So even from a basic just research, or not research, but a like resource perspective, this is not a good use of the time of the agency if you think that they have a proper role. And I think protecting competition is a proper role, but they're not really doing it, and you're not protecting competition if you're not winning. So that's kind of that's the gist of what the study says.
Fred or Paul?
I have a question, if I may, about that. Has your study looked at the theories of harm that are presented in the cases, especially under the Biden administration? Because they've won cases where they bring traditional theories of harm to the consumer. They've struggled when it is something other than that. So I'm wondering if you've been able to dissect that a little bit.
So we haven't completely done it in a comprehensive manner. We've done it a little bit anecdotally. I know it's been spoken a bit today that there are some cases that they've won, and the FTC isn't losing every single thing they put forward. But a lot of the ones that they are winning have the more traditional slants that they're using. But you do see when you have them trying to use very novel legal theories, the really easy ones to kind of look at are Meta and Microsoft. You see that they're not having success really pushing those legal theories forward.
So, first of all, I'm very interested in seeing your study when it comes out. During the Trump administration, or at least the second half of it, there was an increase in the number of cases that they were undertaking, at least high-profile ones. But I think looking forward, I was struck by something that Sean Heather said on the last panel with the U.S. Chamber. He basically said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that Lina Khan doesn't care if she loses cases. She doesn't care what it does to the morale of the people at the FTC. If she loses and it results in some legislation coming into play that's going to radically overhaul the statutes, she's good with that or can live with that. And I would also just say in general, she has nothing to lose at this point by being, even bolder, even more audacious, even more aggressive at this point. She's not going to be renominated if there's a Republican president coming in. And she may be getting to the point where if some calmer, more rational voices come into play in the Biden administration, that they might not want to reappoint her going forward. Now, that's probably a stretch, but that's a possibility. She knows in her heart of hearts, she's at the pinnacle of her power, the pinnacle of her job right now, and this might be going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but in that sense, she kind of reminds me of Donald Rumsfeld. I mean, Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense for President Ford at like age 35. And 40 years later, he came back and did the same thing. I mean, you can bet that if Lina Khan is not in there, she's going to know what she lost. So she's going to make the most of what's going on. And I wouldn't underestimate her audacity. She seems to like the limelight. She dabbles into every issue under the sun that you can conceive of. So, I think there's not going to be a let-up in her energy level. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, maybe when she comes back in 40 years, she'll be a little less energetic. It's the best we could hope for, I suppose.
May I just add something to that?
Sure.
Chair Khan may not have something to lose, but the FTC certainly does. I think they are on the verge of losing their credibility if they keep going to court with these wild theories and losing cases, and Congress sees that, as we heard in the first panel. There could be reason for Congress to say, okay, FTC, you can focus on consumer protection, and we're moving your antitrust shop over to the DOJ. I think they really risk that.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. It wasn't long ago, before Biden, I remember people used to say, especially with regard to internet regulation, they would say, let the FTC do it. That's a nice non-political objective organization. No one would say that today, so perhaps they've already thrown away their reputation, sadly. Speaking of losing cases, and this doesn't just involve FTC, but the whole Biden administration, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, there's still, very big antitrust cases out there with Amazon and Google. Do any of you have predictions about what's going to happen in the Amazon and Google various cases?
I would take a pass on
Okay.
that as I'm not an attorney, but I would just point out these are involved, complicated
Yes.
cases,
Yep.
and you can expect that they're going to be methodically litigated, if you will.
I will also pass on guessing because I am also not an attorney. The one thing I will know is we brought up the Amazon case, and I think it's an interesting thing within antitrust in general. And obviously, I come from a consumer perspective, but I think as an average consumer, it'd be very difficult to look at the efforts of the agency to go after Amazon for one of the most popular products in America, and also basically say, like, consumer, you're not smart enough to figure out how to cancel a service. And I think it'd be very hard to look at those two actions and be like, yeah, this is a consumer protection action that we're doing. And so that's my one comment on that.
Correct.
I don't have much of a prediction other than I think it's going to be difficult to prove such a narrow market. That market to me doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's more than just online retail.
All right, thank you.
Yeah,
Well, go ahead.
If I could just add to that, I mean, there's a broader public issue here, if you will. I mean, I'm trying to figure out who the victims are of Google and Amazon. I mean, and I know if you listen to this convoluted case that's made, it's people who are not able to grow their businesses as much otherwise out there. This is not a concern that's, within the top 10 or the top 20 for the American people. Number one, they don't see there as being any harm on this. I mean, I have never had anybody come up to me and say, yeah, I'm really disappointed with what Google did, or, I mean, I can't believe Amazon delivered the thing a day earlier than I expected and I wasn't home. That's about as that's about as bad as it gets. But it's a bizarre place to hang your hat on, and maybe some calmer heads at the FTC on this will prevail, and some of the more disconcerting things, be it in healthcare or grocery or whatnot, maybe that's where they will turn. So.
If we're focusing on the consumer welfare standard, it wasn't long ago that we were blaming Amazon for the inability to raise prices. When the Fed was trying to increase the inflation after the financial crisis, there were headlines saying Amazon's hurting us, keeping the prices too low.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the services now that are, that the antitrust regulators are going after are free.
Right.
But I should also point out that people like to critics of the consumer welfare standard like to narrowly define it as just being about price. But it's about general consumer welfare, about quality, about innovation, all those things. But yeah, I certainly agree that you don't hear a lot of complaints like, my computer shocked me when I decided to use, something other than Google search.
Yeah.
You just don't hear that. Now we won't make any predictions about if and when the two Republican nominees to the FTC, Andrew Ferguson and Melissa Holyoke, will be confirmed. But if they are confirmed, do you think that's going to make a difference? I mean, they won't form a majority, but they will have a voice.
It will make a difference. It will at least temper some of the more outrageous actions. That's not to say it's going to stop them from going forward. But there will be authoritative voices, presumably, that will point out those concerns, call out those concerns. Commissioner Slaughter has forged a rather interesting relationship with Ted Cruz. I mean, there seems to be a lot of mutual respect there between them, and allegedly some undercurrents with her and Chair Khan. So you're not going to be able to stop the most audacious actions, but having some voices at that level of commissioner who are opposed to it, that's going to make Congress more emboldened on these things, and I think it will have some effect in terms of constraining them, but it's not going to be a majority. So.
I'm a little bit less hopeful for them. One, because they're still going to be the minority within the agency, and two, I think we're going to see that some of this bias against tech really is bipartisan. I think when you look at Ferguson and you look at Holyoke, he helped and supported a lot of efforts to like regulate TikTok at the state level, and then she has kind of bragged about going after Google for what she terms exclusionary contact or conduct in the Play Store. And so I think it might be like dialed down a notch, but I think we're going to see some of the same biases against tech companies, even with the more conservative commissioners.
When the FTC finally takes a test case for some of the structural presumptions in the new guidelines, having the two commissioners could actually be damaging to the acceptance of those guidelines if they dissent on voting out a case, saying that whatever theory supported by what's in the guidelines isn't in fact illegal. And I think that's where we could see some long-term policy problems for the FTC with having these guidelines adopted or accepted.
You're saying basically courts will defer less if there's dissent. So, what do you think? One thing that we know is going to happen in 2024 is there's going to be a presidential election campaign. Do you think that competition / antitrust is going to be a big issue, whether it's regarding big tech or pharmaceuticals or anything else? And if so, how do you think the debate will play out and affect the election?
Yeah, I just don't see it being a big issue out there. You might see Trump tweet about Lena Khan for some obnoxious statement or something like that, but I think these issues are just not going to be probed. It's very unfortunate because there's a true anti-business feeling in this country right now, or at least I get the sense of it from the two political parties. Democrats just don't like business. Republicans kind of like it. They don't like big corporations. They don't like a lot of tech-oriented companies. And, those movers and drivers of the American economy that, I talked about before, those guys, who are looking to take a shot, looking to build a $10 to $50 million company to generate a lot of value, to generate a lot of wealth to other folks. They're not really part of our political dialogue here. So aside from the fact that the dialogue is shallow and that contingent has been shut out, I don't see these issues even coming up at a presidential debate.
I generally like to tell people that I work in policy, not politics, so whatever my predictions on the political realm are, take with a teaspoon of salt or whatever. But I do think, unfortunately, on both sides of the aisle, we are seeing an acceptance of the bias against kind of like large firms, whether it's big ag, big tech, big what have you. I think we are seeing a bit of a bias against those, and I think that insofar as competition policy kind of emerges within the political debate, they'll probably take the form of going after these big companies or going after these companies that are shipping your jobs to overseas or silencing you online. I think that kind of narrative will continue, but unfortunately I don't think it will be as focused on the specific policies as I would like to see it.
I agree with that. I don't think it'll play a major role in the campaigns, and it's, to me, because both parties don't disagree with weaponizing antitrust. I could see the Republicans doing the exact same thing, just for a different reason, to serve a different goal, and that's why they're risk averse to debating it on the stage.
Well, it's fair to say if Biden wins the election, probably not much will change. But if Trump wins, will it make a big difference? What kind of difference? I mean, certainly Trump is no fan of big tech, but perhaps they'll go after something different instead of. So what changes, what differences do you see under a possible Trump administration?
Well, I think it's next to impossible to predict what a Trump administration would do in this area. The one thing that is probably going to govern that conduct is Trump is going to want to put in place loyalists of his to the FTC. Now, if anybody has an idea of who those loyalists are who would make good FTC candidates, then that I'd like to hear about them, and that would be a significant development. I don't think, though, that from a policy perspective, this is something that Trump is engaged in. This is going to be delegated out to aides and people that he brings in. He's in general not going to want to be seen as a friend not only of big tech but of bigger companies in general. But it's the Wild West in terms of predicting anything on this and what his policies are going to be going forward. I guess if it's any consolation to anybody, it's probably easier to make predictions if Biden stays in, but those aren't too optimistic. At least I would posit going forward here.
One thing I will say is the Biden administration gets a lot of criticism, and rightly so. But and I referenced this study a little bit earlier, but when we were looking at the overall trends by administration, we saw a lot of the trends that took off under the Biden administration really starting under the Trump administration. So if his past is any prediction of his future, which I don't know how good of a gauge that is, but if it is an indication, then I think best case scenario, we get kind of like a diet Linicon regime, and worst case scenario, we get just the same.
I don't think the uptick in litigation under the Trump administration was really a surprise. They said they were going to, and commissioners, if Commissioners Phillips and Wilson are any guide, those cases were taken because they were adhering to the consumer welfare standard. And if there's a third Republican commissioner, if we fill these two openings now, but with a Trump administration, a potential Trump administration, a third Republican commissioner, I feel we could go back to that, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a lot of reversal of the new merger guidelines and reverting back to the 2010 horizontal and 2020 vertical. Rescinding the Section 5 policy statement and going back to the old one. A lot of things like that could change immediately.
So you're making a positive prediction,
Yes.
which is because none of us are against, enforcing antitrust law, including the consumer welfare standard. So you're saying vigorous enforcement, but lawful.
Correct.
Let's hope. I want to turn to European regulators, which have already been mentioned. The European Commission and the UK's Competition and Markets Authority have been challenging basically the same acquisitions as the FTC, and maybe that's not even a coincidence. There's certainly FTC is talking to those folks. Is that a problem? And if so, is there anything we can do about it?
Yeah, I think it's a major problem. I mean, the U.S. and the European Union are economic competitors. I mean, yes, we invest in one another, we trade with one another. At the end of the day, we're economic competitors, and we have squared off with them on a number of issues. We squared off for 17 years about aircraft manufacturing in 2 Democrat and 2 Republican administrations. Agriculture, alcohol, any number of measures that are out there. President Trump, during his administration, the European Union started to take a run at Google on some things, and Trump responded, "This is outrageous what they're doing, and by the way, we'll do it here in the U.S." Now, that underscores, I think, a very important point here. American companies are American companies, and they should expect that their government is going to have their back. And if there's going to be some regulation that needs to take place, it ought to take place here. It ought to be discussed here. It ought to be adjudicated here. And the fact that you've got these measures which could result in hundreds of billions of dollars of annual fines against America's most successful tech companies, money which is not going to go to inner city projects here in the U.S. It's going to be taken by European bureaucrats to do Lord knows what without those funds. The fact that we're not only acquiescing to this, but helping these people along and meeting with these regulators when they come to the U.S. and flying over for events in Brussels and Barcelona to commiserate about this stuff, it is just wrong on a very guttural level. It's probably wrong legally because the Department of Justice should have the lead on this, and it's wrong from a standpoint that America doesn't get anything out of this. I mean, we could potentially see disruptions in the stock market if there are some very bold initiatives that the European companies need to take. And I had an article a couple of weeks back. I quoted Barack Obama about this very measure, talking about how the Europeans, and I'm paraphrasing here, but they get all high and mighty, talking about how principled they are when all they want to do is, protect their own tech businesses. I think he said this to some tech podcast, so he might have thought it was never going to get picked up, but it did. And in any event, American companies should be regulated by the American government. And the other thing that's very disconcerting about this play-up with the European Union, we have a major competitor in China. We need to think, we need to be thinking about China in the context of economic competition. We need to be thinking about China in the context of mergers that are allowed. I mean, if we have two U.S. companies that are going to go broke or are going to have large control of a market, what does the context of China mean on that versus just the domestic market? So, again, just not a fan of the European Union.
Well, Fred and Tirzah, please address the European question, but Paul also raised the question of China. Is what the FTC is doing really a boon to Chinese companies, our competitors? So please feel free to address either or both of those questions.
I think my concern with the FTC getting or any antitrust enforcement in the U.S. mirroring that of the EU is not so much that it's mirroring the EU, but the fact that EU has bad policy. And antitrust in the U.S. Has generally, historically, at least for the last couple decades, worked under certain presumptions that markets do work, but when they fail, that's when regulators need to step in. And so I think shifting the enforcement, which more closely mirrors the EU, into that of markets are inherently harmful and we have to step in and protect consumers more often than not, that I think is the core problem. If the EU had great policy and Linacon was just stealing their playbook, great, do that, easy for you, I guess. But I think the problem is that it's shifting away from it's shifting towards a harmful policy.
And that's what was so concerning about the Illumina Grail case is how the jurisdictional claim came about in the European Union, where Grail had no sales, and they needed to be petitioned by member states to gain jurisdiction. I'm also concerned about the CMA. We're not just focused on one European regulator anymore. The CMA is really flexing its muscles in the tech space, and there are a few proposals, and it looks like the FTC wrote them to help the CMA go after some of the big tech companies that they can't go after here. Some of the turnover thresholds and the global revenue thresholds will only target American companies, and that's something the FTC should not be involved in doing.
Well, because of Europe's overregulation, they don't have any of the top 10 biggest tech
Right.
companies, which
Right.
means almost by definition they're going after our companies. And your mention of the CMA, I should point out that, you know, in the Microsoft Activision case, which we've talked about, the EU had approved it, and CMA was a holdout for a long time. So yeah, CMA is becoming more assertive. I want to turn to the application of antitrust to AI. That's not just been increasing focus in the media, but a big focus of the FTC, which is concerned about Microsoft's stake in OpenAI, and Amazon and Google have big investments in Anthropic. 2 weeks ago, the FTC launched a, quote, study of competition in the AI industry. You know, they're allowed to do these 6B studies of broadly competition in an industry, but this was a thinly veiled excuse to give it the power to demand documents from all the companies that I just named. I'll start with Tirzah, because I know AI is one of her focus. Is there any real reason for, you know, anti-competition concerns around AI, especially since, you know, none of these big companies have a majority stake in you know, Anthropic, OpenAI, and other companies like that?
I think one of the realities of AI that is probably not being recognized as much as it should, specifically within the FTC, is that it's a new industry. So having a limited number of players in a new industry isn't like this groundbreaking thing. And the second that I think also needs to really be recognized is that AI is a very resource intensive product to develop and put out. And the idea that these mom and pop shops outside of their garage are going to be able to do it, I think is a little bit unrealistic. And these partnerships are really necessary. And I think sometimes I guess I'm projecting what I think she must be thinking a bit, but I think Lina Khan sometimes looks at these things and she's like, oh, it's a relationship, it must be predatory, who's the predator, who's the victim, and doesn't leave room for the fact that some of these relationships are mutually beneficial. And I think in the case of this AI, she's very concerned that big tech is getting involved and that they might be sinking their claws into something, and not as concerned with the fact that they may be helping these relatively small firms.
I'll just want to elaborate on one point you said, which was, again, back when I was with the AI startup, I literally could build a neural network model, you know, on my desktop computer. Now it takes vast computing resources that only the biggest companies in the world, you know, cloud resources have. So partnerships between the little companies and big tech are, you know, absolutely inevitable. So, but anyway, Paul or Fred, do you have any thoughts?
When you have a commissioner and a commission that don't believe in markets and allowing the market to function and the competition to play out, of course your urge is going to be to quickly regulate it and try to block some of these relationships.
So, again, I'm trying to figure out what the problem is here. You have three of America's most successful, resourceful companies in a very promising area of technology competing with one another, doing research there. Again, I think we have to expand the conversation here, and more importantly, the FTC and the Biden administration has to expand the conversation. You know, what is China doing with AI? I mean, whatever they're up to, I think it's in our best interest to have our best companies delve into that area, develop that area, and be ahead of what those competitors are doing. Now, is there potential for abuses on that? Do those need to be monitored? Yes. But that's different than fearing that a couple of companies are going to somehow, some way, have a monopolistic position in an industry which is in its very nascent stages. And at the same time, is not a new industry per se. There's AI that, you know, we use in different applications here. But My concern is that, or I guess a fundamental concern is that we don't want to slow down an area which is going to be pivotal for providing benefits to the U.S. economy. It should be pivotal if it's steered in that way, and which we have to think of ourselves as being in competition with China on. Don't have to worry about the EU because they're terrible in tech. So, we'll just stick with that.
There are reports of an acrimonious turf battle between the FTC and DOJ over the clearance process for investigating antitrust in AI. They're particularly focused again on Microsoft and OpenAI. And I think most people most people who are in favor of the consumer welfare standard hope that DOJ, wins the turf battle, both because it's, less ideological than the FTC, and also because the number one factor that's supposed to govern in the clearance process is expertise. And DOJ has expertise in search because it handled the Google, or is handling the Google search case, and there's a very close relationship between search and ChatGPT. I mean, search has for a long time used AI, and ChatGPT is in a sense a more sophisticated form of search. But in any case, so that's what I think a lot of folks are rooting for. But FTC's just opened this investigation. It's called a study of competition, a 6B study of competition, but it's really and that allows them to demand documents from these companies. FTC's, making a power grab here. Are they going to succeed? Who do you think should and will, win this battle?
I guess it's kind of a non-answer, a separate answer. I think the fact that there is a turf war between these agencies is indicative of the larger problem. If you're talking about legal consistency, then how the antitrust laws in the U.S. are enforced should not come down to or be influenced by which agency wins your case. And so I think when we're talking about that, it is important to fix it and address it and come up with some measure to handle it. But B, it's more important to realize why it is such a problem. And the problem is if antitrust laws aren't being enforced equally across the different agencies. And particularly, both agencies are a little bit problematic with it right now, but really refocusing antitrust on where it was supposed to be, on the consumer, on the protection of our laws. And so I think that's key with the turf war. That just points to the overall big problems within the agencies themselves.
Fred or Paul, about who should win the turf battle and who will win the turf battle?
Well, I would just say I'm not so sure it's a turf war. I mean, I think what unites the FTC and the DOJ is much greater than what divides it here. Look, I mean, the DOJ can be as ardent, as aggressive as the FTC is about certain matters. So I guess what I would say is, in a certain sense, it doesn't matter. What matters is what happens after that going forward. And I don't know that you can necessarily extrapolate that if one wins, it's therefore going to be more moderate or more reasonable than if the other wins, because there's a lot of iterations that can be done going forward. It just underscores the fact that they're both audacious, aggressive organizations at this point.
Right.
I don't have much to add to that other than the FTC will be able to say the 6B study does make them smarter. Whether the results are predetermined, like some of their ongoing 6B studies will likely be, I'm not sure if it really helps their case, but that's going to be their claim.
So perhaps that's their strategy to do it so they can claim jurisdiction here. So I guess we better, since we don't have that much time left, I guess we better turn to questions. Are there any? Sacha?
Hey guys, thanks for that. Satya Marar of the Mercatus Center. There have been a lot of questions raised recently about whether the FTC even is a truly independent agency. And one of the suggested ideas has been to roll its antitrust enforcement function into the DOJ and leave the FTC as just doing consumer protections. We don't have this issue of dual enforcement. You know, the FTC talking about using unfair methods of competition under Section 5 as a way to prosecute conduct that courts have said is not anti-competitive and doesn't violate any of the other antitrust laws. I was wondering if the panel had any thoughts on that. Is that a good idea? Are there any problems with it? Yeah.
I think the devil is going to be in the details on that. In general, it sounds good. In general, consolidation in government sounds good to us as a conservative think tank. But a lot can happen as laws get written. So,
Any other thoughts?
I would just also say that, and this is kind of reiterating my answer to a previous question, but if we don't address how these agencies are going after enforcement and some of their legal theories behind that, then I think you're going to run into the same problem, whether enforcement is through the FTC or whether it's through the DOJ.
The FTC's been much louder in their enforcement, and I think if they keep losing cases and bringing bad ones, Congress may want to consider that, and quite frankly, I think they should.
Well, I don't know how many of you were here for the first panel, but certainly the two congressmen that we had seemed like they would be in favor of that. So, so yeah, Congress can do more than just oversight; they can actually pass legislation. So, Alden? Yeah.
Just to mention, Kurt, thank you. Alden Abbott, Mercatus. The European Union is enacting and will implement an AI Act, the first major AI Act in the world, which will be very regulatory, only adding to the problems of European regulation that Paul was mentioning. Also, a potential AI regulation by the FTC is alluded to in the Biden executive order on AI, which was issued in December. So that will give them a hook to also argue. And I think they'll also argue for jurisdiction because of their consumer protection. They're going to argue there are lots of deception and privacy issues tied to AI. They have the statutory authority, so they should probably have a hook to also look at competition issues affected by that.
So basically, you know, how are you all feeling about the AI Act? I know a lot of people in the AI community are worried about it, but how about in the antitrust community? Tirzah, I know you do a lot with AI. So.
I would say, as a whole, yeah, it's really burdensome. It's very regulation heavy, but one bright spot, and it's a very small bright spot, and they're chipping away at it, is that they at least did recognize that not all AI applications, and side note, finding a proper definition for AI in law is a whole other issue, but putting that aside for now, they did at least recognize that there are different levels of harm within the various applications of AI. And so I thought that was one bright spot. And if we're going to be copying the EU, maybe we can just only do that small sliver.
Thoughts from Fred and Paul?
First of all, I would defer to Tirzah on the AI discussion. I would just say in general, you know, we're in the early innings of this whole technology here, and we do not want to constrain our best and brightest companies from developing AI in a responsible manner. And there's a lot of opportunity there, and a lot to look for, but continued vigilance is going to be key.
I'll defer to Tirzah, but I can only say quick reaction to a lot of moving parts. I would just suggest Congress take a walk around the block and cool off before overly burdening an industry that's barely gotten off the ground.
Right. Yeah, the Europeans did not wait.
Right.
But,
Another
it's-
reason why they don't have a large tech company.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard enough for a lot of congressmen to understand technical issues, but here's, a rapidly developing, new technology that they really, really don't understand. And, let's all hope that they don't just, for grandstanding purposes, regulate it anyway. So, are there any other questions out there?
More of a comment, maybe you
Okay.
you all can respond to that. It kind of fits under the chaos discussion that you started with. Is the FTC yesterday submitted a comment on a NIST request for information about the sort of the governance of the Bayh-Dole Act, which affects university tech transfer, and they were arguing in there supporting the Biden administration's plan to expand the march-in right to include, based on the current price of the product that ultimately resulted, which was, will cause tremendous chaos in the ability to move early stage technologies coming out of the universities into the marketplace, because again, to the point earlier where you were talking about how a lot of entrepreneurs seek a buyout as part of their incentive to go, and that is being impaired. And now if they know that their patents are not going to be available to them to support their ability to recover their investment at the time, they finally bring their product to market. Again, it's just going to be another impairment of the ability to develop and innovate and move products into the private sector. And it's just the FTC now is again getting involved in that where they had never before, and not in a good way.
Could you just, because not everyone knows what march-in rights are, just maybe say a sentence or two about that?
Sure. The Bayh-Dole Act, which is sort of established university technology transfer back in 1980, made it clear that universities and inventors there, instead of the government, would own the inventions and the patents there too, and be allowed to then commercialize them. And because at the time the government, because it funded a lot of these technologies, claimed ownership of everything, contrary to 2 centuries of American intellectual property law. But we can talk about that. So that changed everything. So it allowed the market to take over, and again allowed the universities to drive these products into the marketplace in partnership with entrepreneurs. But it did reserve in the act. It did reserve the ability to sort of what they call march in if the private sector was not moving the product forward. If for some reason it was incapable or unwilling to move the product forward into the marketplace, the government, the agency that provided the initial funding, could march in and relicense that technology to another partner to ensure that it could get to the public. But there were very specific criteria that were set up, because it was sort of a break glass in case of emergency sort of arrangement. Now the administration and the FTC is supporting this, is they want to expand it to any time they think that the price is not where it should be. We're going to march in, take that company's patent from them, and try to give it to somebody else in a way to foster competition. But it really won't accomplish that. It'll just kill our ability to innovate and move products forward.
So yet another way in which the Biden administration is anti-business beyond what previous Democratic administrations have been. So any thoughts, panelists, on competition, innovation, and patents?
Competition's great. Competition is alive and well in the U.S. economy. I mean, this administration, predominantly through, lawyers, academics, and others, sought to define for the American business community what competition is. Had the nerve to say that there is not enough competition in America today. There is plenty of competition out there. There's competition internationally, and competition is alive and well, and it's good. And the fact that there is so much competition is one reason why government should stay back, so that things can go forward. Things can prosper. And you know, I'm getting up there in age, and you know, I've known a lot of business people over my life, and the vast majority of them are just good people who want to do the right thing. They've got families to support. They want to live honorably, and they want to live competitively. You know, competition not only makes for a better product, it makes for a better society. I mean, look at the competition we have in sports and the unity that can bring. So bring on competition. It's good. It's not bad.
If this administration is serious about promoting competition, starting with the regulatory state would be a good idea. Well, rather than relying on the antitrust agencies to promote it. They should be a line of last resort.
Any thoughts, Tirzah?
Yeah, there's definitely a link between competition, innovation, and IP protections. I think that reasonable people can disagree as to the specifics of those IP protections, but I think definitely margins, I think we can all agree that takes it a little bit too far, and when we're already doing a lot through our antitrust agencies to discourage innovation, we probably don't need to find another arm of the law to discourage it in a different way.
And I should add that, you know, maybe the Supreme Court will help us in reining in regulators. There's several big administrative law cases this term. We probably won't know the results till the spring, but there's the Loper, Bright, and Relentless cases in which the Supreme Court might very well either overthrow or at least tell, cut back on the Chevron doctrine. There's the Jerkesi case, which is really a challenge to in-house proceedings at, the FTC and other agencies. So that'll make for an exciting spring at the Supreme Court. Before we wrap it up, are there any further questions? All right, then I think we will proceed to the reception. I hope you all can join us. It's just across the hallway, open bar and food and hopefully interesting discussion. So thank you all very much for attending.
Thank you.